It happened on a Saturday afternoon, the kind California is known for warm lights, spilling across trimmed lawns and quiet streets. I stood at the kitchen counter, setting a tray of cookies onto a plate. The guests were already outside on the back patio. My daughter, Lena's colleagues, her husband, Scott's girlfriends, and a few women from her yoga group. My name is Eleanor Hawkins. I am 68 years old, and this used to be my home. I stepped onto the patio with the tray in my hands, smiling gently like I always do. "Cookies, anyone?" I offered. A few people nodded politely, reaching for one without much enthusiasm. I caught Scott's eye. He smiled faintly, then looked away. Then Lena, my daughter, gestured toward me with her cocktail glass and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, she's just always here, like part of the furniture." Some people laughed, not cruelly, but awkwardly. Still, it stung. I felt my hands tremble around the tray, but I said nothing, just turned around and went back into the kitchen. Later that week, I dropped a glass while reaching for a mug. It shattered on the tile floor, and I bent down to gather the pieces. That's when Lena stormed in. "What did you do now?" she snapped. "I'm sorry," I whispered. She raised a hand to stop me. "You need to know your place. Don't think just because you're old, you have a right to stay here. You clean a few crumbs and think that entitles you to space." I froze. "If you don't get out of this house," she hissed, "I'll call the cops." I looked up from the shards of glass in my hand and said the words I hadn't said in years. "I'm your mother." She didn't even blink. "You think that matters?" And that's the moment I knew it didn't matter to her at all. But the house still mattered to me. The house on Maple Grove Lane wasn't just wood and windows to me. It was memory layered into walls. Thomas and I first stepped inside it in the spring of 1983. The paint was peeling, the floors groaned underfoot, and the kitchen still had avocado-colored tile from the 1950s. But to us, it was a dream waiting to be built. We didn't have much. He was an HVAC repairman. I was a librarian. We saved every dime we could. While other couples honeymooned in Europe, we drove to a borrowed cabin in the woods and ate canned chili with plastic spoons. That was who we were. Humble, hopeful, determined. I remember the day we painted the living room. Thomas was on a ladder in his old jeans, humming a George Jones song under his breath. Lena, 6 years old then, danced barefoot across the drop cloths with green paint smudged on her cheek. He laughed and said, "Those were the best years. Dinners on the porch, Halloween costumes made by hand, a backyard that tried to grow tomatoes but mostly grew weeds." Still, it was ours. When Thomas got sick in 2006, the house became his hospice. We moved his bed downstairs. I made soup. I stayed up every night rubbing his back. He passed one morning with the sun on his face and my hand in his. I stayed in the house 5 more years. Some nights I swore I could still hear him whistling from the kitchen. Then came the loneliness. Lena visited less. The house felt hollow even with all its history. She suggested I move in with her and Scott. "It'll be better, Mom. You'll have company. And we've got the space now." I didn't want to leave. But loneliness has a way of making even silence feel like company. I packed up the photos, folded the curtains, and handed the keys to a property manager. I told myself I was gaining family. I didn't realize I was giving up something I'd never get back. At first, living with Lena and Scott was pleasant. Lena brought me herbal tea in the evenings. Scott helped set up my bookshelf. For a while, it felt like a new Chapter 3 adult sharing a space, easing one another's loneliness. But it didn't stay that way. Slowly, my things began to disappear. My needlework basket was moved to the garage. A framed photo of Thomas and me was replaced by a sleek abstract print. The old clock from our living room was boxed away. When I asked about it, Lena just said, "We're updating the look." Then came the rules. No boiling garlic, the smell lingers. No TV past 9, we're winding down. No guests. Unless pre-approved, it's just respectful. I obeyed them all. Then, one day, she asked me to remove the flower pots from the patio. "They make the space feel crowded," she said. I had planted those pots with care rosemary, mint lavender, but I moved them. I always complied. That's what mothers do. Until one night, I came downstairs to warm a glass of milk. I paused when I heard voices in the living room. "She's just always there," Lena said. "She's exhausting," she added. "It's like having emotional clutter in the house." I stood in the hallway, frozen in the dark, holding that empty glass. I didn't make a sound. I didn't confront them. I just listened. That's the thing about silence. It's not weakness, it's memory taking notes. The next morning, I folded laundry tighter than it needed to be. I watered her roses, even though she hadn't touched them in months. I packed her lunches when she worked late. I swept the porch before they woke up. But I stopped smiling. Because it no longer felt like kindness. It felt like servitude. And for the first time since I moved in, I realized something no one had said aloud. I didn't live there. I merely stayed there. Lena never asked about the house I left behind. She assumed I had given it up entirely. What she didn't know, what she never thought to ask, was that the title had never changed hands. It was still mine. I kept the deed locked in an old drawer, tucked between Thomas's letters and our wedding certificate. Even when I moved out, I couldn't bring myself to let it go. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe I just knew not to place my trust and comfort that came too easily. One Thursday afternoon, Lena came into my room, holding a sleek leather folder. She sat across from me like a salesperson ready to pitch. "Mom, I need a favor," she said too smoothly. "What kind of favor?" I asked. "It's just some paperwork. About the house. It would make things easier for taxes and refinancing. You'd still live here, of course. Nothing changes." Her voice was warm, rehearsed. I stared at her. "I don't think that's necessary," I said, folding a towel with deliberate care. She sighed, annoyed. "It's just a signature, Mom. You don't even have to leave the house. Harold can notarize it if he's still alive." I looked her in the eyes and said the first real no I'd said in years. She didn't like that. A week later, my phone rang. It was the bank. They had questions about a home equity application, one that listed Lena Hawkins as the primary owner of the Maple Grove property. Confused, I asked for more information. They sent over the paperwork. There it was. Her signature, claiming she had inherited the house, claiming she was now caring for her elderly mother and managing all financial matters. I sat at the kitchen table, the documents spread before me, my hands trembling. It wasn't just disrespect. It was theft. Later that evening, I stood in her spotless kitchen and said calmly, "I spoke to the bank. I know what you did." She didn't deny it. "You shouldn't dig into things you don't understand," she said coldly, sipping water. "I understand perfectly," I replied. She tried to steal the roof Thomas and I built with our bare hands, and I wasn't going to let her. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my room, the lights off, the old suitcase I hadn't touched in years pulled from the back of the closet. I placed it on the bed and began to pack. A few clean blouses, my leather wallet, the marriage certificate Thomas and I signed in 1967, his death certificate, and most importantly, the deed to the house. My hand brushed against an old photo frame. Thomas, in his wedding suit, smiling like he'd just won something precious. Me in a cream-colored dress my mother helped me sew. I wrapped it in a scarf and placed it carefully inside. Then I sat at the small desk and wrote a note. Just one paragraph. "Lena, I don't hate you, but I'm done begging for space in a home I paid for with my life. I have nothing left to give and nothing left to ask." I left the note under the porcelain teapot she always ignored. Then I slipped on my shoes and walked out the back door. It was just past 3 a.m. The air was crisp. Spring jasmine mixed with the faint scent of pavement. I walked down the street without looking back. By 9:45 that morning, I stood at the doorstep of Harold Finley's bungalow. Citrus trees framed his porch, and a wind chime rang gently from the eaves. He opened the door in a cardigan and slippers. His reading glasses sat crooked on his forehead. "Eleanor," he said, "you look like hell." I laughed for the first time in weeks. Inside, at his kitchen table, I spread out the documents, the deed, tax bills, original purchase contract, all in my name. She tried to take it, I said, but it's still mine. Harold nodded. She doesn't have a legal leg to stand on. This house is yours, every inch. I want to sell it, I said, quickly. He didn't question me, just nodded again, steady and certain. You'll need a realtor, he said. I already have someone in mind. Because I had rehearsed this moment for weeks, and I was finally ready. Her name was Valerie Monroe, mid-50s, recently divorced, looking for a quiet place to start over. I met her once briefly years ago through a friend at the library. Now she was my buyer. The listing went live at 8:14 a.m. Jessica, my realtor, sent me a message. We already have 3 inquiries. It's going fast. By 4 p.m., there were 3 full-price offers. Valerie's was clean cash, no contingencies, ready to close within a week. I signed without hesitation. That evening, I booked a small hotel near downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I slept with the window cracked open and the city lights blinking beyond the curtain. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something. The next morning, at precisely 8:30 a.m., a courier delivered a certified envelope to Lena's doorstep. Inside was the signed, notarized deed. The new owner's name, Valerie Monroe. The house was no longer mine, but it was no longer hers either. Attached was a formal notice of tenancy termination, 7 days to vacate, or Valerie had the right to initiate legal eviction. The envelope bore my name in the center line. Not Mom, not Mother, just Eleanor Hawkins. That same afternoon, the phone call started. First one, then another, then 4 more in a row. By the time I had made tea and sat by the window, she had called 7 times. No voicemails, no explanations, just her name flashing across the screen again and again. She didn't want answers, she wanted control, and I didn't owe her that anymore. By noon, Jessica texted me. Your daughter called me pretending to be the owner, trying to block the sale. I shut it down immediately. She had tried one last move, one last lie. But the papers were already filed with the county, and the keys were no longer hers to turn. She thought I wouldn't go through with it. She thought I was still afraid to be alone. She forgot I had been alone long before I left her house. The difference now. I wasn't lonely. I was free. It didn't take long for the neighbors to notice. By midweek, whispers floated between hedges, and driveway greetings turned into murmurs. I heard she's getting evicted. No, she's squatting. Her mother sold the house without saying a word. And the one that echoed loudest, can you imagine being thrown out of your own mother's house? I imagine Lena heard them too. That Friday morning, she stepped outside wearing sunglasses and lipstick that was just a shade too bright. She held her chin high, but the bags under her eyes betrayed her. So did the tension in her mouth. She packed slowly. I think part of her hoped someone would intervene, that I would arrive with an apology and open arms, that some miracle would undo the years of choices she made and erase the consequences. But no miracle came, just silence, and a moving truck she had to pay for herself. She wheeled 2 expensive suitcases down the porch steps, glancing around like a woman still expecting rescue. Scott stood by the car, arms folded. Can you take this? She asked, offering him one of the bags. He shook his head and stepped back. I'm going to my mother's, he said, voice flat. Lena blinked. You're leaving. He didn't answer, just got in the car and drove away. She stood there alone on the curb, a woman surrounded by designer luggage and nothing else. The phone in her hand buzzed again. Probably spam, maybe friends who had finally heard the story. But not me. I hadn't called. I wouldn't. She'd spoken at me for years. She never truly listened, not once. So now I let silence speak for me. She thought I'd crumble, that I'd come running. Instead, I let her stand there with nothing but what she packed, the same way I had once stood invisible in the kitchen. The difference? She could leave. And I had already left a long time ago. That night, around 9 p.m., There was a knock at the security gate of my new apartment building. I had just made tea, mint and chamomile, the kind Thomas used to make on stormy nights. The city stretched out beyond my window, lit in gold and neon, alive but distant. I checked the monitor. It was Lena. No sunglasses, no lipstick, just tired eyes, smudged makeup, and a duffel bag clutched in both hands like a life vest. She buzzed once, then again, and then, slowly, she knelt down on the sidewalk outside the gate, looking directly into the camera. "Mom," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I didn't move. Please, just let me in. Just for a little while. I have nowhere else to go." She clasped her palms together, like she used to when she was 5, praying for a puppy or a second scoop of ice cream. The intercom remained silent. I stood there for a long moment, watching the screen, watching her hope flicker in real time. Then I stepped away from the monitor, walked to the window, and drew the curtain closed. I didn't do it with rage. I did it with peace. Because I'd already learned the lesson she never thought I'd figure out: some bridges don't burn with fire. They rot slowly from years of disrespect, until one day you realize there's no crossing back. The next morning she came again. Hair messy, jacket too thin for the cold. She pressed the intercom, voice cracked. "Mom, just until I figure things out." I stepped onto the balcony above. She looked up and saw me, her face lit up, eyes wide with the kind of desperate hope that only appears when someone thinks forgiveness is owed by default. I didn't yell. I didn't scold. I just looked down and said calmly, "Don't ever think you can fool an old woman, especially your own mother." Her face fell. She nodded once, as if she finally understood. And I turned, walked inside, picked up my tea, and closed the curtain behind me. She thought I was being cruel, but really, I was just being done. My new apartment was on the 24th floor, nestled in the heart of the city. It wasn't grand, but it was mine, fully paid for with the sale of the house Thomas and I once called home. I kept it simple: a small reading nook by the window, a wooden desk, a stack of classic novels, and on the balcony, a row of mint plants in clay pots, just like the ones I used to grow back on Maple Grove Lane. Sometimes in the mornings, I'd crush a leaf between my fingers and breathe in the scent. It reminded me of Thomas, of choir days of kindness. The apartment didn't feel empty. It felt like rest. Lena still called from time to time. The phone would light up with her name sometimes twice in an evening, but I no longer picked up because I had already said everything I needed to say. Not with words, but with action. She had called me a burden. She had tried to take what wasn't hers. She had forgotten who built the wall she grew up inside. But I remembered, and I reclaimed it. There is a kind of justice in silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence that comes after choosing peace over chaos. That's the silence I live in now. Some nights, I sit on the balcony with a cup of tea and let the wind hum between the buildings. The city below me pulses and shines, but up here, I am still. No one interrupts. No one corrects. No one belittles. I don't walk on eggshells anymore. I walk on my own floors. The kind I chose, the kind I earned. There's nothing glamorous about being forgotten in your own family, but there is something beautiful in remembering yourself. And I have remembered who I am. Not just a mother, not just a widow, but a woman who kept the papers, kept her dignity, and when the moment came, stood up without raising her voice. She tried to define me with silence. I redefined her with mine. If you've ever folded the laundry, cooked the meals, swept the floors, paid the bills only to be told you were just in the way. If you've ever stood in a room you helped build and been made to feel like a guest. If your silence was mistaken for weakness, then this story is yours too. I used to believe love meant patience. That forgiveness was something automatic between mothers and daughters. But there's a point where silence becomes survival, and survival becomes clarity. When Lena looked me in the eye and said, "You don't own this house," she meant to erase me, but instead she reminded me exactly what I had built. So I didn't raise my voice. I raised the deed, and I walked away. A. If this story meant something to you, if you saw yourself in my silence or my strength, then share it. Comment your story, a story. Subscribe to The Art of Revenge, because here we don't shout. We remember. We write. We reclaim. Because justice doesn't always knock loudly. Sometimes she wears pearls and drinks her tea slow.